All right, so let's talk about the three-stage model of memory. Before we begin this, I want to make sure that we understand two terms because they're going to come in handy when we look at these three stages. And the first is going to be capacity. Whenever we look at the word capacity, we're talking about how much. So in reference to memory, how much information is there. And then duration refers to how long does it stay there. So each stage is a little bit different. So remember, capacity, how much, duration, how long. All right, so here is an example of our three-stage model of memory. You'll see that very first stage is going to be our sensory memory, which moves to short-term memory, which hopefully ends up in long-term memory. So three very distinctive stages. All right, so with our sensory memory, its sole purpose is to just receive sensory information. So we've talked about that before. It's sight, it's auditory, it is being able to feel things. So whatever our sensory information is from out here going inside is going to be first captured in the sensory memory. All right, then we have the short-term memory, and the purpose of the short-term memory is once we get that sensory information is to make sense of it. So anytime you're in that processing stage of memory, you're in short-term memory. It's also called working memory, and during this time is when we hope to be able to work the information well enough to where we transfer it to long-term memory. And long-term memory is just simply a storage facility. So just think of it as a storage cabinet for your information. So for instance, you see it, you hear it, you taste it, you touch it. That instant we begin to pay attention to it, we move it over into short term where we're trying to analyze it, we're trying to understand it, we're trying to respond to it. So anytime, again, we're processing information, we're going to be working in that short term or working memory. And then, of course, in long term, we're going to store that information. All right, so now going back to capacity and duration, if you think about your sensory memory, you have all of your senses at work at all times. That is way too much information to process. And so we really can't count how many different hues of yellow that we see, or how many different sounds, you know, the fan, the computer, the people in the next room, etc. We can't measure. It's too much to take in. However, in short-term memory, there's a very specific measurement, and we call that 7 plus or minus 2 pieces of information, which just simply means 5 to 9 pieces. So on a good day, you may be operating on 9 pieces, where you can hear, take in, and remember 9 pieces of information. And on some days when you haven't had a great night's sleep, perhaps it's just 5 pieces of information. So if you think about it, when your instructors are lecturing, sometimes you have to ask them to repeat. Why? Because their definitions may be more than, 5 pieces of information when you're operating on a really low level of sleep and having a 5-piece of information day. So it exceeds our capacity. All right, for long-term memory, although it may feel like you're trying to cram too much into your brain, we have found that no brains have exploded on San Jacinto College campus due to trying to cram too much long-term information into it. So again, it's limitless. Now again, we're talking about no age-related degeneration, no trauma, and no illnesses. It would be limitless. All right, now we're talking about duration. That's how much. So if we're looking at sensory memory, it only lasts 2 to 3 seconds. So the whole purpose of this is to receive the sensory information and make the decision, do I want to pay attention to this? If we choose to pay attention to it, then of course it moves into short-term memory. Now it's not super long there either, 20 to 30 seconds. And you probably experienced this before, where you have just heard something and then you're sitting there going, wait a minute, what was I just thinking about? That just means you've exceeded the 20 to 30 seconds that you were originally investing in it. All right, so if we use that short-term memory and we work it and work it and work it and work it, hopefully it will end up in long-term memory. Now, how long does it stay there? Again, if we eliminate age progression, the age degeneration, and head trauma and illness, it's relatively permanent. So if none of those things existed, your memory would be just as good as it was when you very first learned information. All right, so now let's just say it's time to study. So you're reading your notes, you're reading your flashcards, you're doing whatever, you're listening to lecture again. At that point, you're in sensory memory. When you try to start to make sense of it, like with Dorky Hints, what we do is we link our new information to the old information, and that gives it meaning. So it's extremely meaningful. You maybe put your personal reference onto that, you put it into your own words, etc. But when you can finally actually understand it, encoding takes place. Once information is encoded, and what we mean by encoding is just putting it into a brain language so that it is ready to be stored. Once encoding takes place, it simply is moved into long-term memory where we're going to keep it until it's time to take the test. So again, let's go ahead and look and see what happens. So when you're taking your test, you obviously see the words on the page. Then what you do is you try to make sense of what those words are asking. You're trying to understand the question. You're trying to pick out the important words. Anytime you're trying to process that test question, then you are in short term. Then finally, you find that answer. You've made sense of it. So you find the answer. Something called retrieval takes place. And so you take that information that you just remembered because it was stored in long-term memory. You bring it back into the short term where you're going to write it down. All right, so again, let's see how this works. And we're going to be talking about distractions here in a minute, which I know many of us have during our study time. All right, so let's just say that you're sitting down, you're studying, you're trying to understand what is in the book. So at seeing the words, you're in your sensory memory. Now, if your hypothalamus, remember that brain structure, if your hypothalamus starts reminding you that you haven't eaten today, whatever has happened to that sensory memory is going to get dropped because now that hunger has taken its place. Remember, sensory memory, 2 to 3 seconds. It's not going to last long. But let's say you go ahead and you go to eat and you're back studying again and you're trying to make sense of it. You're linking it. You're trying to understand what's being said. You're trying to find some relevant examples. Now you're in short term trying to process. Now, if you use this term called elaborate rehearsal, that just simply means studying with meaning. If it becomes a meaningful thing to you, in other words, we talked about this in class, where you could actually sit down and explain it to somebody without your notes, that means that that's study with meaning. Dorky Hints is also an example of elaborate rehearsal. You've done this well enough that you understand it, and coding's going to take place again. That's just putting it into the brain language so that it can be filed. And if we do that successfully, it ends up in long-term memory where it's stored. All right, so here's a couple of questions for you. Do you study in an area where there are distractions? Remember, your brain doesn't shut off everything. And so we want to make sure that we are distraction-free when we're trying to actually study. And do you have a study method that works for you? Because if we don't, encoding's not going to take place. So no matter how hard you try, you're not going to be able to get that information. So again, study method that works for you is extremely important. All right, hopefully that helps.